The Sine Institute of Policy and Politics is American University's incubator for policy innovation. We convene leaders in the academic, public, private, nonprofit, and journalism sectors to engage and promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. In an evolving world, we seize the opportunity to work on the nation's most pressing challenges through collaboration by experts and top scholars in their field with students in research and scholarship. As part of that goal, the Sine Institute leverages American University's location in our nation's capital, the nexus of government and a growing international business center. We connect diverse perspectives from around the country and around the world with our world-class academics and research, experienced practitioners, and the most politically active student body in the U.S. We stand apart through our focus on the role of business and the nonprofit community in public policy, the rise of the importance of economic regions in the United States, and international policy issues. Our focus is to make an immediate impact at the intersection of policy and politics that leads to real and lasting change. Thank you for joining us as we convene, communicate, and collaborate. Introducing Sine Institute Fellow 2022, Barbara Comstock.
Good afternoon. It's great to be with you. And welcome to my class, A Woman in the Arena. Of course, we are virtual today to talk about women in leadership, but I certainly hope in our future classes that we will be able to be in person, health conditions allowing. So first, I'd like to kick it off by just having us think about something I did as a child, and hopefully many of you did as people who are engaged and involved in public policy and politics. As I visited our nation's capital, my mom was a teacher. My first mentor took me to Washington, D.C. She took me to Williamsburg to walk through, all of that, real life history. We went to Monticello, we went to Mount Vernon, we visited Boston and went on the Freedom Trail, and then other places throughout the country. We'd always visit, some president's home or a museum that was steeped in all of our history. And one of the things that I certainly appreciate now, but I don't think I did when I was young, is when you went in, say, to the Capitol and you see all those portraits of people who have been there governing, doing things. They're mostly men, and they are mostly white men. And then when you go and you realize how much has changed over the years. But it's only been 100 years since we had women who were in elected office. Jeannette Rankin from Montana was the first woman to be elected in 1916 and then come into office in 1917. So you realize how recent that is. She only served one term. She was a Republican, and she was somebody who voted against World War I, which was an unpopular position. So she decided not to run again, in consecutive terms. And then years later, after her activism and involvement with getting women the vote, because she was elected before women actually had the vote, she ran again in 1940, I believe it was. And then she voted against World War II, again, an unpopular position. So she didn't stand for re-election, but there's been no woman from Montana since. So quite a long stretch there in Montana that they haven't had women. But in our entire history in government, in Congress, US Congress, there have only been 11,107, approximately. There may have been a recent election that I missed, but there's only been 11,107 women elected to Congress. That includes both the House and the Senate, and the 17 women who've actually been both. So there's only been, you think about, like, if you know of Senator Tammy Duckworth, who Democrat from Illinois, she was in the House. She was actually in the House when I was there. Then she ran for Senate. She's there. She is also a veteran. A mom while she was in office. Susan Collins, another woman who was in the House and then went to the Senate. They are two, and there's several others in the Senate now, but only 17 women in total have been both the House and the Senate. So you think that's a pretty normal path for many men to have gone from the Senate to the House, but for women, there's only 17. There've only been 397 women total in Congress. And so that is a 3.6% of that 11,107. And only 58 senators, and again, 17 who are both. And then that includes 52 African-American women in total, out of those 11,107, 16 Asian Pacific women, 23 Latino, Hispanic women, with the first only being in the 1990s, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, and then only 9 women who've been in military service. It's actually been split, 4 Republicans, 5 Democrats. You'd think that might be a more common path to leadership. Tammy Duckworth, as I mentioned, is a senator who also served in the military. And so of those 397 women who have ever in our history served in Congress, 149 of them are currently serving. So that's about 37% of the women who've ever been in Congress are there now. There are 125 in the House and 24 in the Senate. They are kind of unevenly distributed between parties. I am a Republican, so when I was elected to office in Virginia, I was only the 4th woman ever elected to Congress from Virginia in 2014. So you see how rare that still is and how many of you may be part of electing the next first or yourself being those first, whether it's the first African-American man in your district or your state, or first Latino in your state or district. There's still so many first. We have only had one speaker of the House who is a woman, obviously Nancy Pelosi, who is currently there and previously was a speaker. We have only had one Vice President Harris, who is there right now. And women were really in the single digits until 1941. 10 were elected then. It was kind of even, 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans. But by 1980, when Ronald Reagan, 42 years ago, when he was elected president, there actually were more Republican women than Democrat. Not much, it was 12 to 11, but Republicans were more. And then the high water mark for Republican women before 2020 was actually 2005, where there were all of 25 Republican women, while there were 43 Democrats in 2005. Then Donald Trump came along, and regardless of what you think of him, I'm not a fan, but he had, I would say, a big role in electing a lot of women to Congress in 2018. There were 36 new Democrat women who were elected in 2018, which got it to 89 Democrat women were in office, and that was over a 40% increase in the number of women they had had. And then that made for 43 women of color in 2018. Only one of them were Republicans. And after 2018, since many of our women, including me, lost in 2018, we were down to, I believe it was 12 women. So in just one cycle, women in Congress, Democrat versus Republican, went from 3 to 1, it was Democrat women to Republican women, to 7 to 1, where Democrats had 89 women and Republicans only had 12. Now, I am on 2 boards right now that help Republican women get elected, and we were none too happy about that. So we went to work in 2020, and as it turned out, most of the winners in the close elections were either women or minorities or both, or military members. It was a big surprise, even to those of us who are working on it, that we got up to, I believe it was 31 in 2020. Which still it got us back to our 3 to 1 being outnumbered, Democrat to Republican. But it also shows you, with 125 women in the House, the only way you are really going to reach parity out of the 435 is to have more Republican women elected too. So, and actually I see a question here. Do you have an example of working with a Democrat in Congress to get things done? I'm tired of all this division. Amen. And I will point out, as we've gotten more women in the House, one of the things that I found the most satisfying working in Congress was when I got to work with my female colleagues. And in fact, when I called to make my concession speech to a female who did replace me, I said to her, join the Women's Caucus because you will find it very delightful to work with. And while I was in Congress, and it's something that we're probably going to do a whole class on later in the program, is I was able to work on sexual harassment issues, which came to the fore with the whole Me Too movement in 2017. And Debbie Dingle, who is a great friend and colleague of mine, and I, who had actually we also worked on a resolution on hate crimes that we did together and did get it passed. But we also worked together on sexual harassment legislation, along with Jackie Spear, who is a Democrat from California, who was a leader in this area herself and had been working and had legislation that was out there. And so we sat down when we saw all of the things, if you remember back with Me Too, and again, we'll go into more detail on this later, first it came up with, Harvey Weinstein and Hollywood and all of that. And then we had people on TV, you had anchors on TV, Matt Lauer left and others that had to leave their jobs because of what were very credible allegations. And then when we saw that, we said, it's not just going to be Hollywood or the entertainment industry or TV. We know sexual harassment is in all professions. We know it is not in one party or the other party. So we started working on that legislation pretty quickly as those things broke. And we were able to successfully get that passed. And also during that time, we had a number of Democrat and Republican men. During that time, there was only men who were resigning because of what were seen as credible allegations. And through that all, I think a lot of people didn't think we could get it done, but fortunately we were able to sit down together. And it was one of the most delightful experiences I had from a legislative standpoint, because we had a great colleague who's actually not in Congress anymore, Bradley Byrne, but he was a conservative Republican from Alabama who had worked in labor law and was very experienced in this field because he had gone into boards of directors or companies and said, you have to fire this guy because this conduct is unacceptable in any workplace. And it had actually been, the rules in the workplace, in the private sector, were much stricter than we had in Congress. So we sat down with Jackie and with Debbie and with others, and we went through the laundry list of requests that we had from both Democrat and Republican sides, and we were able to put that together. So it was a tough time. I mean, actually, ironically, Donald Trump, who's had accusations in this area, signed the bill himself. There was not a public bill signing, maybe for obvious reasons, but the bill did get signed and is now in place. And again, as I mentioned, we can go into more detail on that topic because I think that's a very important topic for all women from the beginnings of their careers, even back in high school and younger women, to be aware of predatory people, men largely, because it does tend to be more men than women in this area, but it's something, whether it was trafficking of women or sexual harassment or discrimination, it's something that we really wanted to get from the lowest staff person as well as interns now have to take classes. We have a whole setup that we put in there. But again, that was a great opportunity to do that. And human trafficking was another issue that we often work together through the Women's Caucus. And I know dear friend of mine, Jamie Herrera Butler, who a Republican woman from Washington State, she has worked done great work on a bipartisan basis on women and maternal health. She has special needs. She has 3 children while she's been in Congress, but she has a special needs child. So she's been somebody like myself. She voted against Obamacare repeal because it wasn't sufficiently protecting, we thought, pre-existing conditions, and particularly, situations like, children who would have disabilities and all. So she's a great leader on that front also. So happy to tell you, and that also, as we talk about men or women in the arena, one of the things that I do want to tell you, because I was privileged to be a Washington intern at American University when I was in college. So that sparked I had interest before that and family interest. My mom was always engaged in politics. But because of that great experience I had at American University, I wanted to come to Washington, have those experiences. I worked on Capitol Hill myself. Then I was a staff, policy person. Then I was a counsel on an investigative committee. And then I went on to the Justice Department and did public affairs. Then I was in the private sector. And then when I was older, unlike, a lot of people run younger today, but when I was older, kind of mid-career, was when I was recruited by a man to run, my former boss, who Frank Wolf, whose place I ultimately ended up taking on in Congress, but he recruited me to run in the State House. And one of the reasons I like to do these classes and talk to young people who are interested in public service is I want to tell you, it's not like what you see on television day to day. And it's not as, you get a bad impression of what it is like if you watch either network and people are fighting. There certainly is a lot of nastiness to it, but if you know your history, it's always been like that. Certainly the Civil War, it was very ugly, caning on the House floor, beating up on each other. Certainly, you go back, if you've watched Hamilton, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson went at it. So it has always been thus, but it is a great privilege. And I still feel that way. And I can tell you, as I was one of the top targets every time I ran, because I had, I guess it was 7 elections in 9 years, or 8 elections with my primaries. I wasn't supposed to win any of them, primary or general. I was always a top target. So I say this as somebody who had millions of dollars spent attacking me. I can certainly tell you about the not fun parts of when people come after you. But, you kind of, because I had served, worked with others, seen others under attack, but also understood that history of the satisfaction of getting to serve your country, serve your community, get bills like sexual harassment legislation, like human trafficking legislation. I got to work on bills and pass bills that were about dealing with gang violence that was plaguing in our area, our communities here. Oftentimes, and the targets were people who had come here from other countries who were trying to be then getting recruited by gang members, and a lot of violence there. So the satisfaction of doing that, often comes with a lot of slings and arrows. But if you take that perspective, the history you've learned, the experiences you've had working with people, it is I just can't tell you, it's such a wonderful area to work in, which is why I continue, even though I am not in office, I work on the issues that I'm passionate about. I started a young women's leadership program at George Mason University, where I work with high school students in the summer to get them kind of conditioned to think of themselves as leaders in whatever profession they go into. I still work on boards helping veterans deal with Alzheimer's and deal with other veterans issues. I've been honored to be able to also go on corporate board working on tech issues that I'm interested in. I continue to work on those. My district had a lot of areas, did a lot in the technology space. We're kind of the Silicon Valley of the East. So I've continued to do it. So no matter where you are throughout your life or throughout your career, you can always get involved in politics and policy, and at different times of your life do different things. I'll tell you, our recent governor in Virginia, who just was sworn in, Glenn Youngkin, I met through a woman who is now his commerce secretary. And both of them helped me back in 2009 when I was running for office for the House of Delegates in Virginia. And those relationships throughout, while I was serving, they were very helpful in just, helping me get elected, but also in advice and counsel on any number of things and issues. And now here he is elected and my friend. So these things, go throughout your life, and it's just a pleasure to always be able to interact with people. And also, like I said, for women to empower others. Now, I did see we have a question from a student in the chat. So would you happen to know the stats for lesbian and trans women? I don't have those handy. Obviously, some of, there definitely are now, we have a senator, I guess Tammy Baldwin from Wisconsin, and also somebody who's been prominent in the news, who I served with in the House, but is now in the Senate, Kirsten Sinema, I believe, I also identifies as bisexual. So, and the thing that is interesting now is those aren't issues, because you do have both Republicans and Democrats who are supportive, with the change in gay marriage. I think you're seeing a lot of difference there. So again, we do have active on the Republican side now too. So let me see, read the rest of this question. Governors, I don't know on that. So, but I do know there is a pretty, I don't have the website, but I can put it up here. The center at Rutgers has a lot of those details and shows the first, but that does that's a good question, going to the fact that there are still many firsts to be out there. And, and those, that'll happen in your lifetime, and you can be a part of helping. There's a lot of different groups, both Democrat and Republican, who are making sure that everybody has those opportunities. Let's see. I will. I will. Yeah, nope, I don't have more of those on there, but I did fail to mention. So if there's anyone in the audience who is from Vermont, Vermont is the only state that has never elected a woman to Congress. So no women, it's actually only been white men. So they will be able to have lots of firsts in a lot of different areas. And then the only other place that hasn't in our country is the Northern Mariana Islands, which is a territory, also hasn't elected a woman, but every other state, so the 49 other states, have elected a woman. But many states still haven't elected, all kinds of, any other, in any other areas. So that's still to come. And so I think that's always important to be mindful of as you're looking at it. It's something that I actually, when I first ran for office in the House of Delegates, I didn't think of it really in those terms, because I had known some women in office, but I'd never sat down and done the numbers. And then I got into my Republican caucus in the State House, and we were, I think, 5 or 6 women out of 60. And that, when you sat in the room there, then you realize, because I had worked in staffs where often, on Capitol Hill right now, you had a lot of chiefs of staff who are women. The numbers are pretty high there. And that had been my experience for years. But then when you got there as an elected yourself, it was like, whoa, I didn't realize there were so few. And that's part of the reason I did start my Young Women's Leadership Program, because I realized even at my age, where I always thought, okay, women can do anything. You know, I hadn't thought of running for office. Actually, it turned out until a man, my former boss, Congressman Wolf, said, hey, we need someone to run for this seat. You'd be good for it. Why don't you run? And then after I was elected, I thought, wow, I never thought myself of running. And many of my women friends who were in a lot of high positions had never said, we hadn't said to each other, hey, you should run, or why don't you look at that, or why don't you take that job? So actually, the way I came to thinking about it was I read the book back in 2010. So it was 1 year after I was elected, Lean In by Sheryl Sandberg. If you all haven't seen her 17-minute Lean In video about why women still aren't at that parity of 50-50, I think she does a great job of explaining that. She talks about, her three pieces of advice in her book are, get a seat at the table, no matter where you are. Said often what happens, you go in, there's a room of 20 people or so, the women will take like the back seats. They won't go up to the table. And she said, if you're invited into that room, you have a seat at the table. You raise your hand, you engage on this. And then another good piece of advice that she gives in terms of interpersonal relationships is said, make your partner a partner. If you are married or have a significant other, make sure that you aren't the one maybe doing all the childcare things, all the house things, that this is split, and that you support each other in your careers, and that you really have a partnership here where it's not just one, where say a woman is the one taking all of the burden on that side. And I'm pleased to see, I was always very lucky because my husband's a teacher. He was always more than half in terms of helping me, because he'd be home after school. He'd be getting the kids in the summers. He would be taking care of kids and getting them to their swim classes or their camps and their programs. And then when he went for his master's degree and was a principal, that we, divvied it up a little differently. But I think that's a great advice. And she points out, and I would say this is, that people who share those duties more equally do have better relationships. And I hope I feel like that's true. And I always thought that was good advice. And I think she gave good advice there. And then I think her final point was, don't leave before you leave, which is oftentimes when women are thinking about having children or getting married, they cut back on what they're going to do. And I'm pleased to say I don't see that as often with women doing that. I know I never did, because, we needed to make money. I needed to work. But I know with my children and their spouses, because they have those partnerships, they're able to continue to make that a partnership in how they each decide how to divvy up the childcare. Now, I see the question here too. What differences do women of color and minority women face that, say, a white woman wouldn't have to deal with? In our second and third classes, we are going to really deal with that, because we're going to that second class is going to be on sort of all your different careers and how that sort of, preparing to run, but also the kind of career experience you might want to have. And then the challenges that women, and particularly women of color, might face in those arenas. And then our third class is going to be on actually running and engaging. And we want to identify for you a lot of the groups that can help you on both sides. This is bipartisan. I'm Republican, but I'm very fortunate to have friends on from both sides. A good friend of mine, Donna Edwards, just jumped in, is running for Congress in Maryland. For any of you Democrats who are looking for a woman to support, and she's an African-American woman who served in Congress, ran for Senate, was supported by the Emily's List, but unfortunately the guy did beat her out. I think she's just wonderful. We probably disagree on lots of issues, but she is a wonderful public servant, and she is very much involved in women in leadership and minority leadership too. So hopefully from those examples, we'll be able to get more of that in the second and third classes. Let me see now. Okay, I see in 2021, 9 women are serving as governors. The record high is 9, which was set previously. So yes, we are still, that is an area where, again, oftentimes people overlook the State House. And if you look at that Center for Women's Politics at Rutgers, they have the breakdowns also on state legislative roles. There are more women getting elected in the State House now. In some state houses, you will see when you look at those, have reached parity. And it's often the states, because I didn't go through some of the states here, I'll point out, like California has the most women ever elected in Congress. So, which is 46 women, which is 11.5% of all women who've ever been elected. So no surprise then that the first woman speaker was from California. The first woman vice president was from California. And the state legislature in California, women have leadership roles too. So often when the state legislators, the State House, the State Senate, and say the governors, when you have that dynamic there, then women are seeing each other in those roles, and it makes them more likely to run themselves. Like I mentioned here in Virginia, Karen Merrick, who is a friend of mine, she was involved in both the governor's race in 2009 and my race, and then she decided to run for state senate in 2011. She didn't win that race, but she stayed engaged and involved. She's a tech entrepreneur, sold a very successful, then she went into philanthropy, continued to work on women on boards and women in leadership roles. And now she herself is a commerce secretary and has that role for Virginia and has all that great experience over that time. And I think one of the things, I'll make sure to pick up some of your questions here. Do I have to run for office, or are there other ways to contribute? Not at all. And I can tell you, as someone who didn't run for office until my children were grown and I was older and had my both public sector career and a private sector career, I didn't expect to run. I was really an accidental candidate. It was when my former boss called me and said, hey, we need someone here. We want to all get behind you. You should do it. And it happened to be at a time in my life that I could do it. But no, there were so many ways that you can be engaged. And that's, like I can tell you, Donna Edwards, for example, in the time when she ran for Senate, I believe in 2016, and now she's been writing a column in the Washington Post. She's been active in, she was active on the presidential campaign last year. You've seen her probably on TV talking about issues too, but she also, weighs in on the issues that are important to her. And so if you're a policy expert in an area, I looked in many cases when I was in Congress, those people who I knew really knew their stuff, whether they were male or female, had a big impact on me because I knew my staff, which were often young because the salaries are not high on the Hill, and they were covering a multitude of issues. We had to go to those experts. And so we had to say, on sexual harassment, I went to outside experts who and I wanted to go to women. And so we went to the women who had worked on those issues in the military and elsewhere. So the expert community, say if you're in a think tank or if you're working on a particular issue and you've spent your whole career working on that issue, and that's what a lot of women do, those women are just as important in the policymaking process, and often more so. So, if you, Marian Wright Edelman worked on children's issues for years, and I know, certainly you would see her impact, many, she was a Democrat, worked with Democrats more, but many of the issues she worked on crossed over. Certainly Republican and women and men were supported them, but obviously she had a big impact there, as did, I think a friend of mine who actually ran for office several times early in her career ended up heading up the Northern Virginia Technology Council in Virginia. And when I was both in the State House and in Congress, I knew not only that she had that expertise, but she knew all the experts in those areas. So when I had questions about cybersecurity, when I had questions about, economic impacts on, and jobs, she had that expertise that she had built over 25 years of serving in a role where she was interacting with all of the leaders. And I'll tell you, she probably had a bigger impact on Virginia being the Silicon of the East than any elected person that I can think of, because she continued to stay engaged in politics, help people get elected, but also then, on the policy front. So you do not at all need to run for elective office, because I know in my case, until I was older, until my kids kind of were through college, because I needed, I was working in the private sector, paying tuition. My husband was a committed public servant on the education front. So, those salaries aren't high. So often I couldn't stay, we needed to make life choices based on, getting our kids through college and all. But I was pleased that I was able to go back into public service later in my life. It was a 10-year detour that was accidental. Now I'm back out. But as I said, I still engage in a lot of the issues that I care about. I've worked on, we may do a class on this later, sort of like crisis things, but also things like 9/11 or January 6th, both of which I've worked on. 9/11, I was at the Justice Department, worked there on the issue, but the January 6th insurrection and all of that violence that happened in the following impeachment, I did work with colleagues on helping get to what ended up being a House committee. I worked with officers who I knew from having been staffer for 10 years, been in Congress for 5 years, these officers who were beaten and abused and who were lobbying for having an investigation. I was proud, I just did it pro bono, but I was proud to go stand with them and go around to offices. I was happy that somebody like Mitt Romney, who I had worked with for president, supported that effort. Others didn't. Liz Cheney, a good friend, is now working on that. She's had to take a real tough stand against her own party, and I'm so proud of her. And so I continue to volunteer in that capacity and however I can to move that investigation forward. I'm very supportive of it. So you can always find different ways to interact and be involved in, and it's often it's relationships. And I think we'll be stressing that throughout our other classes, how it is relationships and the people you work with. And I did want to go through somebody who I think, when I was actually at Harvard teaching a similar class, Wendy Sherman, who's now the Deputy Secretary of State, she's written a book about this, but also she gave sort of top 10 tips that if you'll indulge me, I'll go through these because I think they're just good advice for anybody. It's not they aren't partisan tips. They are her tips from being a senior woman in the arena. And she points out the struggle is never over. Number one, you always have to persist. I would agree. She said women often, and if it's whether it's in each, different women will have different problems, but she talked about how people say, oh, you're hard to work with, you're too tough. Sometimes people would use the B word, don't be B. I did hear that. She did too. Oh, you're not a team player. Or if you're out there, talking about things, you're a little bit too out for yourself. Sheryl Sandberg talks about that. Any woman who's been out there in the arena, you've kind of faced that. Women of color probably face that in a doubly tough way. But you really want to understand that, it's always going to be a struggle. But, and she also points out, number two, okay to have male help. I always had male mentors as well as female mentors. And in our other classes, as we talk about, career and preparing to run and then running, the importance of mentors, you can't overestimate. And find them now. Sometimes you don't even have to find them in person. You can find them online. Find someone whose life story is similar to yours and has had similar struggles and overcomes them. And that will be, I think, will be a great source of inspiration. I know in my women's leadership program, one time I had a woman who talked about how, and I didn't even know this, she was an elected friend of mine. Her mother had had mental health issues and they'd had to move around a lot. Her father had left and she got held back in school because of her mother's moving around. And often she kind of had to be the parent because of those difficulties. And it was really traumatic stuff that she went through. And she was so honest and forthcoming about that and how that made her go into a career that both helped people in that, and then she elective office, how she did that. And several of the young women in our program afterwards kind of came up to her with tears in their eyes saying, thank you for sharing that. So there is always somebody, a woman out there who has probably shared your experience, and find them and learn their story. And if you can't meet them personally, meet them online if they're out there. But also it's good to have male help because they're going to tell you, as oftentimes with my male mentors, like I mentioned, my male colleague who worked on sexual harassment with me, at one point I said to him, I need you to stand up in our conference because our conference is mostly men. And I need them to hear from you as well as me. And he's like, well, I don't want to steal your thunder. You're doing this. I think, no, this needs to be a partnership. And you know this law very well. So he did that. And boy, he called out the guys and it was a thing of beauty. Got them to, he said, I don't want to hear, any of the silly things I've heard. And he got them right into place. And because he was a conservative guy from a southern state, they listened to him. So he was a great ally to have as well as a mentor on the topic. Number 3, Wendy says, help other women up and down, across, help them wherever you are, join with them, and just always make that part of what you do. And I think she's done that. And, you just, wherever you are in the workplace, make sure there's that, but also in your personal lives. Because sometimes you maybe don't want to, you have a difficult situation at work. You might want to talk about this to another woman who's totally outside the circle. So you're not kind of, you're not sure how to deal with something in the workplace. It might be easier to ask someone outside, a mentor outside who's maybe a little older, has gone through these things and can help you. But always, have those interactions with other women. Number 4, she says, recognize the power of your role, even when it's difficult. She was often the only woman in the negotiating room in foreign policy. And that often, and oftentimes when I was in Congress, I might be the only Republican woman on a committee, or I was the only woman in the Virginia delegation. So if a guy made a sexist comment, I don't have another woman to look at and roll my eyes or something. So how do you deal with that? And so know the power of your role and having to say, hey guys, that's not appropriate. I'm the only one here, but, with Wendy, she had an ambassador title along with her counselor role in the past. And so she had to ask for what she needed in that role because she had, she didn't want to just, hey, I need more assistance or whatever. Don't be afraid to do that. Number 5, going slowly through, reflect on your relationship to power. Boy, that's when she said that one, I know for me, that's a tough one because you're just trying to get things done and just sit back and reflecting. And that's where I think it's so helpful to read about the lives of women in leadership. I'm conservative, I'm a Republican. I kind of grew up in the Maggie Thatcher days. I really enjoyed reading her biographies and seeing how she dealt with what were, usually all men that she had to deal with and how she rose in that climate. Certainly, if you read a biography of Nancy Pelosi, when she came up the ranks, that was certainly her situation also. So, by reading about others, you can then transfer that to your roles, even at the beginning of your career, because obviously a lot of you are at the beginning of your career. So how do you work, organize at your workplace? And I think, and with associates, and that's where I think joining different groups outside your workplace, having mentors, finding people who are interested in issues you care about, or if you're involved in campaigns, you get a group of people who you trust, men and women, but, just understand how you feel in your relationship to power. I know one of the things that I did early on when I was working for my congressman, I would jump in and help also on his campaigns. Now that's unpaid, they can't ask you to do it, but I wanted to also see that side of, I was working on policy issues, but I also knew oftentimes he was in a targeted race. So I'd go out and just volunteer for that. And even before I was working for him, I couldn't afford to go to a fundraiser because I had 3 kids and not a lot of money, and was working part-time before I went to work on the Hill. But I asked, hey, can I volunteer at a fundraiser? So I was in the room, I was listening to the speeches, I sat at the table and greeted everybody. And I remember in one house in particular that I was at for a big fundraiser, fast forward, I guess it was 25, 30 years, however many years later, I'm there with the same guy who's holding the fundraiser for me. And the Speaker of the House is there. And I'm like, wow, the first time, I just had to beg, could I come in and take names and work the event to be able to be here. And now, because of those relationships, because then it is, the relationships first with the congressman that I volunteered for, he's the person who called and asked me to run for the State House. And those relationships turned into people who supported me when, as I worked throughout, but I was pleasantly surprised about all those relationships that I had throughout my career turned into people who helped me when I got elected, because we had always had good relationships in whatever sort of jobs and projects that we worked on together. So she talks about 6, create a support group. I think I've sort of covered that here. And she said everywhere she went, she did it. Raise your hand. That's also the good advice of Sheryl Sandberg in her book, and I think pretty much anybody. But, it's often said, when there's some kind of job, I know I was the deputy counsel on a committee for several years before I was the chief counsel. And I had a great mentor who was my chief counsel. And when he was leaving to go, I think he was running for office, he's since become a judge, he said, hey, you need to have this job now. And I was a little intimidated. I was happy to be number 2. You're working really hard. You got the pay increases. But boy, that number 1 job, oftentimes women look down, there's 10 things on the list and you say, oh, but I don't have that 9th or 10th one. Whereas the studies show men say, oh, I've got half of those qualifications. I'll fake it till I make it on the rest. So don't hold yourself back. Realize, you're all getting a great education. You're in a place where you can always, learn more, learn how to do things. And be lifelong learners. My mom's a teacher. She got 2 master's degrees. She now works with the Smithsonian on being a docent, and she's always a lifelong learner. And I'm now on board. So I went back to school to make sure I know everything about how to be a good board member. So I wanted to, but you can also do a lot of these things online too now. So you have a lot more resources than we do that you can do in your odd hours. But raise your hand and take that job when you think it feels right for you, and know that you can learn that 1 or 2 extra things that you think you don't know, and know that the guys will do that anyway. So 8th, ask for what you want. And that's very hard too. And it was explained to me once kind of early in my career was don't, and it's a little dated, but this is don't wait to be asked to the prom. Now I know these days people don't wait to be asked to the prom. They go with friends, or they go with a date, or, whoever can ask whoever. But back in my day, you waited to be asked to the prom. And she said, don't wait to be asked to the prom. If there's a job you want, go and tell people you want it. And I have found that true throughout my career, and often with young people who I've mentored through jobs. It's like, you got to tell me what you want, because I may not be thinking of you in that role. And others who are in your circle may not be thinking of you they may know you in one role, but not the other. And they don't realize when something comes up that, oh, you'd be perfect for this, but I didn't know you were interested or didn't know you wanted to do that. So that's where your relationships and always kind of staying out there and things that you're genuinely involved in, you know, be engaged and involved in those communities that you like. So then you ask for what you want. And if you don't get it at that time, that doesn't mean, like, as Wendy Sherman points out, she wanted to be the Deputy Secretary of State back when she was in the Obama administration. She didn't get that, but then she got it. She ended up right at the end getting it, but now she actually got it from the outset. So she did want that job. She knew that was the job she wanted, and now she has it. And ninth, she says, embrace success and credit your team, because none of us ever do this alone. And, you know, it's exciting to be the first, but you don't want to be the only. So that's why, you know, bring other women in. And I found when I had different leadership roles, whether it was I was a chief counsel on the committee that I worked on in Congress, then I went over to the RNC and I ran an office there. Then I was at the Justice Department. At each of those opportunities, I had a chance to, and unlike some of the guys, I brought more women in. Sometimes I found, particularly with campaigns, women were less likely to want to leave a job and go there, because what happens if you leave? I mean, when I was asked to go work on the Bush campaign in 2000, I had a good job, a good paying job, and had 3 kids who were about to go to college. And if George Bush hadn't won, I would have been out of job, right? So most, you know, a lot of people would say, well, you're the primary breadwinner, your husband's a teacher, do you want to take that risk? But I took that risk because I thought, well, it's going to be a good experience. It's a presidential campaign. If he doesn't win, I knew by that point, I will have met people and relationships, and the skill set I had developed, I would be able to land someplace. And often, if, you know, Sheryl Sandberg talks about that in her video, women not taking risks the way men do. So I'd encourage that, you know, across the board, women, you know, and I'm sure that's the case for, you know, anybody in the minority community or anybody who's been disadvantaged. When you get a good job, taking a risk with that is really hard to do. But usually there's an upside to that, and have trust in your skill set that you'll constantly develop because of doing that on, you know, continuing education in whatever way you can. And then finally, I love this advice, number 10. She says, have fun and have a sense of humor in whatever job you are. The people who are the most unpleasant to deal with in politics are the ones who don't have a sense of humor about themselves or often the situations. People often ask me, was it like House of Cards to be in Congress? I said, no, it was more like Veep, you know, Julia Louis-Dreyfus. And, you know, there were comical scenes all the time. Sometimes you had to laugh at yourself, you know, you had situations you got in, but know what a privilege it is. And I know when I was first elected to Congress, Dick Cheney, who had been the minority whip in the House, came and spoke with our class. And he said, you know, never for a day not appreciate the privilege it is to be here and serve and be able and to be in this House. And that's why I think you saw on January 6th that it was Liz Cheney and her father sitting there, you know, on that day when, you know, with what happened that day, that they had that she had that gumption to be there and stand up for what she thought was right. That's been put into her by her dad. And I've been privileged to have worked with them also, so that I felt that, and I still feel that when I walk in there to talk to any of my colleagues or just when I'm taking students on a visit there. So that's Wendy Sherman's good advice, but let me check in here on some of the questions that you have. Let's see. Yes, New York City just elected majority woman city council and now has an African-American woman speaker. Yeah, and that's a great example of, that's where your future leaders are going to often come from. One of the things that I've learned from I'm on Republican State Legislative Committee board, which gets Republican state and Senate people elected and statewide. that I'm on 2 women boards to get Republican women elected to Congress. And we have found the most success comes from those women who are already elected to other positions. Say they were state senator or state rep, or they were on the city council, because they already have they know the community, they already have a base, they have an operation. And it was no accident that in 2018, most of the people who came in, I think a good 2/3 of the women who won had already held elective office somewhere else. And so that definitely, and oftentimes I know for me, even though I had worked on presidential campaigns, I had worked in Congress, I had worked at, the Justice Department with senior people, the best job I had that sort of prepared me to run for office was that I had been a precinct captain and I just went and always worked my polls. I met Colin Powell at my precinct, which was a delight. You're standing there handing out ballots, and then you meet someone who's like, a personal hero. Virginia has that advantage, obviously, in the area where I live. But that was the thing that prepared me the most. And then, of course, when I ran for the State House, that made it much easier for me to jump in. I had 5 men who opposed me in the congressional primary, but I had already been a top targeted state rep, state delegate in Virginia, they call them. And so I had already kind of gone through a lot of this practice, so to speak, when I ran for Congress, and that made it easier. But those, oftentimes people overlook that job. A lot of people, particularly very successful women and successful men. Donald Trump didn't run for anything. Not that I think he's a success or should have been elected. I didn't support him either time. But oftentimes you see people say, oh, I want to run, they want to run for the top job first. Obviously that worked for Glenn Youngkin. When I told him, hey, that's really hard to do. Actually, no one has done it in the first time ever. I pointed out to him because actually Mark Warner had run first for statewide and lost, then ran again. Same thing with Terry McAuliffe and some others. But so Glenn is the first one sort of in modern history that actually pulled that off. But usually it's easier if you've done these other things. And I have a sister-in-law who's a Houston City Council member. And I tell people I actually enjoyed the State House better. And I know she enjoys the city council job because you actually have to get things done. You have to pass a budget. It has to be a balanced budget, which means you have to compromise. So you really learn how to compromise on a state level. And these people who come, I found the better legislators in Congress were the ones who had already done things on the state and local level or been a prosecutor, because they had already had to work with people across the aisle, people maybe who didn't see eye to eye on them, as opposed to some of these ideologues who come in and they just want to charge the hill and they don't know how to get anything done. So that's a great one to really watch those. Let's see, how do the varying ways candidates are selected each benefit electing more women? I don't know that necessarily that there's different, I probably disagree with people who think, well, if you do it this way, it's easier or not. I myself think I like primaries. I won a it was a convention type primary thing in my first congressional race, but I always think the more people you involve, the better. And so I don't like when people, I'm not crazy about conventions, but if you have to win a convention, then you figure out whatever the rules are, whatever the team is, whatever the process is. I think women who are, or any person who's engaged in their community and involved and has a base of support in multiple different areas. And that's kind of what we'll talk about in our next class, which is, have a life, work in your community, join whatever groups you're interested in. In my case, I had little kids because I had my kids when I was in law school. So when I was running, I'd have my kids out. I actually ran for a local community center board and had my kids there handing out balloons. And the people who came and worked and helped me were the people who I had worked on the auction committee from my preschools and my PTA, as well as my friends from Congressman Wolf's office, who I was working with at the time. So it's having that base of support that allows you to win through any process. Like, you have a situation like AOC was able in her primary to bump off a guy, the nice guy, I've talked to him since, but he was kind of focused on national and leadership and kind of wasn't going home all the time. So she was able to kind of come in there, even though she really hadn't lived there that long, and win in a primary that had a pretty small turnout, but she had activated enough people to turn out. So it depends on who you're running against, what the dynamic of the district is. So I think sometimes people have like ranked choice, which is what happened in Virginia. I mean, if that's what the rules are, then you do it that way. But I don't think there's any one particular way. I think like right now, I am supporting a woman who is running in Alabama for a Senate seat. It's a multi-candidate race. Donald Trump has endorsed Mo Brooks, who was at the January 6th insurrection, talking about kicking ass and taking names. That's who she's running against. And I'm really excited about her race. And she's had a big base of support and worked in a lot of different areas in Alabama. And I am certainly hoping that will be an upset, if not just sort of the logical candidate. And she's gotten in and has a huge, from all the things she's done in her life, she's bringing people in, even people who might have supported Donald Trump. They're not going to just say, oh, well, if he tells me to support this guy, I'm going to support this guy. They're going to say, well, Katie's been there and done this with us. And I know Katie, and she's been involved in things, whereas, Mo's been out, starting insurrections. Maybe I don't want him. So even in Alabama, things like that can, she's make no mistake, she's conservative Republican and checks the boxes on any conservative things that Republicans would want. But I think she's somebody who will be able to come in and get things done and work with other people in a much better way. So I think it really, don't ever let the process hold you back. If you're passionate about doing something, and that's like whether you're working on a campaign or a candidate yourself, or just getting involved in it, it's who's, still, a lot of people don't show up, and it's the people who show up who make the difference and can sort of start a movement and get people behind you. I mean, I know when I ran in 2009 for the State House, I wasn't supposed to win. Even my best friends who supported me saying, what a kamikaze mission. Why are you doing this? And it's going to be really hard to do it. And because Obama had just won Virginia and even won our area, I think. And so I just started going out and I knocked on 10,000 doors, and I brought people from all the different areas of my life that I had worked in, whether it was my church or my preschools or my high schools, my daughter's basketball team, my son's baseball teams, and it all came together and worked to getting me a whole 422 extra votes over what I needed to win. So I don't think that should, if you're passionate about what you want to do and care about the issues, I think you can find a way to work through whatever system or whatever obstacles. And I had never raised money before either. I donated some money, I never raised it. And you raise money by calling everyone you know, calling everyone you don't know, finding new people. And we can talk about that in our class too, because I was a novice on fundraising my first election too. Let me get you a few more questions here. What do you see as the biggest issues we face today in terms of representation, given the hyperpartisan and polarized environment? I think my biggest concern is people saying, I don't want to be involved in it, and I don't want to do that. And I think particularly for young people, it's important for you to be engaged and involved and learn the process. I just had dinner Saturday night with, actually it's a former staffer of mine who has continued to work with me on my Young Women's Leadership Program. So she's been the director of that for me. And she also ran for her city council and won. So she ran once and she didn't win, and then she ran again. So I will point out, oftentimes when women run and don't win, they don't run again. Newt Gingrich ran 3 times before he won. My former boss, Congressman Wolf, the man I replaced in Congress, he ran 3 times before he won. I remember when he had the conversation with my husband saying, well, she may have to run more than one time before she wins. And my husband said, I don't want to do this and not win. So he got out there and he knocked on thousands of doors too to help me. And since he had been a teacher in a number of schools in my area, he roped in a lot of votes too. So it's kind of being plugged into your community that matters. But, it's, I think when you go out, and this is what I always tell candidates, and I did this particularly in my first race, and particularly on bad days, I said, when something nice would happen, I said, if you get involved, like on the ground, even, whether it's a Senate race or a presidential, when you go out door to door, or when you work with a group, or you're in there, you meet other people who kind of share your passions. And then, you feel good about, you're turning the ship, you're making a difference. And I had a little bulletin board that I put up in my first election. And I probably did it some of the other times too, but every time something just really unexpected and great happened, I'd put that note up there. I remember that person I talked to, and just want to, and I, at the end, I always told people, if you're knocking on doors, end on a good door. Someone you have a nice conversation, you really, it's good. And just appreciate how, you're going to have the privilege to represent these people. So when you get to talk to them and hear their concerns, it's really great. And so I just had really nice things happen. Not as many bad things happen as you think might happen. And I probably had a much higher, maybe my threshold for pain or misery was higher than most, because I had worked with a lot of people in tough jobs. But I think that's people turning away from it because they think that it's too polarized. And another piece of advice that I got early in my career, and it has always served me well, is and actually, since I was I first worked for Ted Kennedy when I was at American University, and I came down here to intern. My family were Democrats. I thought I was a Democrat. I found out my roommate was a Republican. I started going to the hearings, and I realized I think I'm more on the other side. So I kind of was a Democrat for Reagan, and then the congressman who was then later, 10 years later, my boss and all, I liked him. So I sort of morphed into that, the other side. But because I had grown up as a Democrat, and then became a Republican, I always had friends on both sides. I mean, when you're in college, you can't be a Republican and not have friends who are Democrats, because there's not as many Republicans in college. So I think whatever, but I always made a practice all through whatever job I had, is to, make friends with people who really think differently than you do on kind of big issues. I'm Catholic. It's very important to me. But I had, friends who were pretty devout atheists, or at least agnostics. And I found it very interesting to hear their approach too, and same thing on issues, even on issues that are really divisive issues. Make sure you have a friend who thinks differently on something you think is pretty important, and realize, gosh, I like them anyway, and then it's a little bit easier to work with people and know their stories and understand it. And I found that helpful, certainly when I was in the State House, General Assembly in Virginia. It's not called the State House, but I work in a lot of different states these days. So, Southwest Virginia, if you haven't visited there, if you haven't gone down in a coal mine, it's very different from Northern Virginia. But when you go down there and you visit, and you talk with people there, you realize, oh, okay, this is what we have in common. Education is a priority. We want to make sure our kids get the best education. Tech, we're trying to push all the way down the valley and get all the way down there. So even though my district was a tech hub, there were places, actually, we ended up getting data centers down on the Virginia border in some really tough areas that needed more investment. So, that wasn't, people down there didn't think they were going to have, a big tech company come down there, and we ended up working that together. So having people who are your friends who think differently and then make sure you respect them. It's one thing to know somebody and you're like, yeah, I don't like them. It's like, have somebody who thinks differently than you, say, they are a wonderful person. They are a wonderful mother. I really like them. And gosh, it's okay that we disagree on these, certainly on candidates, on, I mean, there's Mary Madeline and James Carville are both friends. And, and there you have a couple who had to, lived through it in their marriage all the time. So do make a habit of and you'll learn a lot there too, because oftentimes, people are coming from different, sometimes you're just never going to agree on a goal, but once you understand that, okay, well, we may agree, we agree on the goal, we just disagree on the tactics. So I don't need to fight with you about the goal. We have the same goal. I'm going to try my tactics. And if my tactics work, maybe you'll see the light there, and maybe some of your tactics will work that I'll come around to. But you have to have that discussion and dialogue. And when you're on a city council or when you're in a general assembly or a state house, one of the advantages you have over Congress is when we were in the state house, the general assembly in Virginia, all 100 of us have to sit. We go into session at noon and we all have to sit there, and the bills come up and you debate the bills, and you don't know when they're going to be voted on. They don't, like in Congress, they ring a bell and you have 15 minutes to run to the floor to vote for something. So you don't have to be on the floor listening to the debate. You don't even have to have you might be in a committee hearing doing something else. But in any state house across the country, usually you are sitting there listening to each other. And then when the vote comes up, if you're not sitting in your seat, you miss a vote, which you don't want to do. But the advantage of that is you listen to everybody. You actually really listen to the debate, and you're not just, oh, I know how I'm going to vote on this bill. You actually listen to the other side. And then sometimes what would happen, not infrequently, not all the time, but oftentimes we were the Republicans, we were the majority, we'd say, we could stand up and say, could we take the bill by for the day, is what the way you said it, because I want to take a look at that, and maybe we can tweak the bill so that it's not quite what they want, but let's take that sensitivity into account. And that actually happens on the state level more than it does in Congress, because in Congress, it's become, people like to go on TV and yell and scream. And if you're a Republican, you go on Fox. If you're a Democrat, you go on MSNBC. CNN tries to split the middle a little. But, oftentimes, but I will point out, those people, both Democrat and Republican, who are there on TV all the time screaming at each other, they usually aren't the ones who pass bills. The ones who pass bills are the ones who are in committee, gutting it out, working on the amendments, doing everything. And some of these guys you see on TV, like I said, like Louis Gohmert never passes bills. I don't know if he's on TV that much. I don't watch that much Fox anymore. But same on the Democrat side, because those are the people who they kind of don't get the fact that you don't pass anything unless you get 218 votes. So usually you have to get a cross section of people who agree. Even if you have a pretty big majority, you have to, work with people to get it passed. So if you care about passing legislation, and I did, when I was, Margaret Thatcher, was reputed to have said, I want to spend my capital. She had political capital and she wanted to spend it. A lot of people don't want to spend their capital. I think you're there to get the, important things done that you can get done, and you make those relationships with people. And that also means sometimes that you don't fight with some people that you may not like much, but, you fight with, you make an enemy, they may, it's hard to, then get them back on your side. So if you understand, well, they may be with me on the next bill. So, do I really need to make an enemy of that person? And I think, you've seen some of that going on now in this debate. I think Biden, ran as someone said he was going to bring people together and kind of govern center left. And I think he probably would have done better in a lot of these things if he had started that way. And, everyone else probably has an opinion on it, but, you do have to realize rarely do you have super majorities to work with. So it's going to mean You're going to lose some people on your side. You got to get a few on the other side. And that, like everything in sort of policy and politics, is relationships and being able to sit down and work with people who, you might be from different places and have different ideas. So let's see what else we might have here for you. Oh, what would you tell your 21-year-old self? What advice would you give? Oh, well, I had 3 kids in my 20s. I might tell myself, don't worry about having kids when you're young. And I wish I had had a couple more, maybe. So that's personal. But don't sweat the small stuff. It's going to work out. I mean, I remember when I first went to work for the congressman, my kids were little then, and I had one issue that I was working on, and then he was going to switch me into some others. And I agonized over, should I do this or should I do that? And I realized, whoa, boy, that did not matter. And it was a new opportunity to expand what I was going to work on. And I still could work on the previous issues and not to be afraid that I didn't know something, because he was putting me into tax areas and that. And I said, okay, I've never been a big tax expert, but you know what? I became a tax expert really well. And when I was in Congress, I wasn't on the Ways and Means Committee, but I worked with all the groups when we had our tax bill. And when it came time to increase the child tax credit, that is something I had worked on back in the day. And I kind of, hey, we really want to do this. That's something that Biden supports now too. It's become bipartisan. Child care tax credit. So you get, deductions or credits for the cost of child care. Now, when I was in Congress and we had that, now we have 31 Republicans, but back when I was there, we had a lot fewer. And so there weren't a lot of women who maybe even women, there's certainly the guys, but a lot of them, their wives might not work outside the home. They weren't sensitive to the child care thing. And so an initial draft of the tax bill, they wanted to take that out. And I said, no. Let me tell you. And I walked through and literally showed them like what this would mean to like my daughter and her husband, and how much childcare costs and what. So I know I'm getting a little off of what I told my 21-year-old self, but I'd be like, don't worry, because every time you learn a new issue or you jump into something new, it'll give you a new opportunity. And the relationships there, even if you're in a job that you don't necessarily like, you're going to interact with people, people you might like, learn issues that, I mean, when I went to the Justice Department, I went there post 9/11. I'd had a best friend who had been killed on 9/11, and I hadn't had any interest before 9/11 in going to the Justice Department, but then it became, we were going to be all 9/11 and do this. And so even though I was not an expert on terrorism and all those things, I said, I want to go in there. I mean, I was the director of public relations, so I didn't need to be an expert on terrorism, but certainly I got that education because I was working with the experts, working there at that time when it was so critical. And later on, when I served in Congress, obviously having been in the middle of that at that time was very instructive. And it made me go back and kind of learn, do more of the foreign policy, national security, learn all those. Most importantly, I was interacting with all the people who are experts on that. So they were my sounding boards when I was in Congress from having gone through those fires with us. But I would, don't sweat the small stuff. And I think like I'd also tell myself, make your partner, which Sheryl Sandberg, tells you. But if you don't have a partner or significant other, your family and your community, those are the people who support and kind of like that's the most important part of your life, and your career and these other things are kind of the icing on the cake. The cake is, having relationships and people and things you get to work on that you really care about. And then when something big and fun and you get an opportunity happens, that's like, well, wow, that's great. But then you have all those people to share it with. You have those people you want to bring in. I mean, every time I had like a real good opportunity, I was like, great, I can get these other people in. Or when I was I was at a law firm and I left to go start my own business. Before I left, I was like, well, okay, I can replace myself. I've got the right person. And she was someone I had worked with before. I said, let me bring her in. And I was able to, bring this woman in and replace me. And they were thrilled with her. They didn't miss me a day. She was wonderful. So don't, because you have a good education, and if you are always learning, and if you are always, and I don't mean just, like, I'm not talking just about network. I'm talking about genuine relationships where you care about these people and you care about the issues you're working on, and you're in that community of people who, shares those passions. It'll kind of all come together and you won't, I know I worried about all of those things a lot more than I should have in my 20s, but maybe I didn't. I had those kids, and then I just had to worry about them. So then maybe I didn't worry about my job as much as I maybe should have sometimes. And then I'd also tell my 21-year-old self, or maybe my 31-year-old self, push, I never worried about the titles or things like that. And I'd say, really don't worry about that too much. But from what Wendy Sherman is saying, like, when you want a certain job, tell them you want that job. And then sometimes, and this did happen to me, we'll probably talk about this in some other sessions, but I did have to go in and have those hard conversations about asking for the salaries that, because I researched them. When you're in government, you know what the men make for jobs, and so it's very easy to go in and look, saying, okay, the guy who had my job made this, I'm not, so I need to be up there. Or since I'm actually doing more, I think I need to make more. So I would tell any age self to make sure you know your worth, as Mika Brzezinski has all those good things that she talks about on that, and make sure before you go in there that you practice making sure you get your worth. Because I still go through that with my daughter and my women friends and younger women friends, staff, like, do not undersell yourself. Well, someone asked, is Lieutenant Governor Winsome Sears Virginia's first statewide elected woman? Actually, she is the second. She is the first lieutenant governor female. In 2017, and Jill Vogel, who was a state senator, ran but did not win it. Back in the 90s, Mary Sue Terry was the attorney general. So that's how long it's been since we have had women in Virginia. Jennifer McClellan, who's a friend of mine, actually, we did a class like this together down at Christopher Newport last semester. She ran for governor this time, as did another woman. And so there were two women in the primary, and then Governor McAuliffe, former Governor McAuliffe, decided he wanted to run again. Frankly, I thought, gee, how are these women there were two women who were pretty talented. I knew Jennifer the best, and I thought she was pretty effective and pretty good legislator, and kind of knew Richmond and everything. And I said, how is it that we have to have a guy again? And that even, on the Democrat, I mean, on my side, too, but, they chose not to go with a woman. And I do think one of the things that Republicans have found, certainly in 2020, and why, and certainly found in my races, is that women often overperform men in those districts. So it sometimes can give you in these tight seats, if you have a 2 or 3 point advantage, that can mean the difference between winning and losing. And it can mean the difference between having a majority and not. So, this was a 2-point race in Virginia. And on the Democrat side, it was, I guess if no matter who won the lieutenant governor, we were going to have a woman of color in that seat. So that was going to be a first no matter what. But we also in Virginia, they had the first Hispanic attorney general in Jason Miyares, who won. And actually, and his mom was probably one of his most effective campaigners out there. Moms can really, my dad was too, but family members and friends and your community people are out there who validate and help you are always a big help too. Do you think Hillary should run again? No, I don't. And here's why. I think we need a new generation of leadership. I do not want a rerun of Trump Biden. I think it's time to move on and have new faces. And that's why, someone earlier had brought up that there are only 9 female governors. I think we're going to get more sort of practical, common sense people from governors than from Congress often, because they have to balance a budget, they have to get things done, and that means they have to work across the aisle. I mean, if Glenn Youngkin he has a Democrat Senate that's very narrow and a Republican House that's very narrow, and so for his priorities, I would expect he's going to have to sit down and work with people. And that was the case when I was in the General Assembly. To get some of my bills passed, I had to have Democrat support as well as Republicans. And I just think we need to have new problem-solving people, because it kind of gets tired and old. I don't think Trump won as much as Hillary lost. And so, she's had her time, she's done it. I think it's time for new people to get out there. So, and I think the same thing with Biden. He didn't necessarily win as much as Trump lost. So now we have these candidates who, kind of not inspired anybody. I certainly hope in 2024, I'm doing everything I can to make sure it's not Trump. But I think if Republicans do nominate Trump, he will lose. I'm not saying he can't win the nomination, but I think he will lose. And I already hear from Democrats who don't think it will be Biden, that it'll be somebody else. I do think, I work in a space where Amy Klobuchar is very active, and I think she's still running for president. And I think there's a number of other, but I think governors may be where you see some interesting people. I think Colorado Governor Jared Polis, I believe, he was in the House with me. I think he's been very creative. He's Democrat in Colorado. Chris Sununu, I'm a big fan of in New Hampshire. That's 2 guys I've just mentioned, but there are also women out there. We have a female governor in Iowa. And actually in Iowa, we have a female senator, Republican. We have a female governor who was a lieutenant governor before she became governor. There's a lot of lieutenant governors who are females right now. So that can be your future governors and your future presidential candidates. So I think often the state is the better place to work, because you're able to get things done. You can show progress on things instead of fights, and you can bring some practical sort of executive experience from being a governor that you don't necessarily get on the federal level when you're a senator or a congressperson. So I think probably maybe our nominees will be people that nobody's really even thinking of yet, because there'll be a situation in a state or an issue that comes up, or a crisis where somebody just has that opportunity to be a leader and shine, and people say, wow, that's what I want. I'm a big fan of Governor Hogan. Again, I have women out there I like to, but for an example, he had cancer. He was battling cancer and dealing with all this while he was governor. And then when COVID came, I think he did a particularly good job and was very sensitive to, he needed a mask, we needed a vaccine, because he understood it as a cancer patient. And as someone who has a sister who lives in Maryland who's a cancer patient, who didn't necessarily vote Republican, but did like him and voted for him. Somebody who gets it and has that heart and knows, but that opportunity kind of, showed him to be the pragmatic person that he is. He's a conservative Republican, but he's also somebody who was very sensible in how he's doing things. I think, there are other governors out there, Democrat and Republican, who are doing it. So I think we in Washington tend to think it's all Washington people, but I think when you get out, in which I do now more, and you see how some of these states are run and governors who are creative. Mayor Suarez in Miami, young Republican mayor who I think is very creative. My sister-in-law is a city council person. I was very excited to, see her run for city council and run, and hopefully she has a bright future to do other things there. So I think it's good to get new faces in the mix, and you all can be part of that by being sort of the crew that's in there fueling their campaigns. So I see our questions are, have closed now, and our time is up. But thank you for great questions. And I know we will continue to probably further develop them in some of the other classes. As I mentioned, the next class is going to be on sort of thinking about running and preparing to run and all the different type of resumes. You don't have to have one cookie cutter resume anymore, which is a great thing. So I both will provide a lot of different examples, but also I'm still working on our special guest, but we will have one and talking about that. And then we will follow on the actual running for election, our sexual harassment class. And then the final class, I may get a little bit more input from you on what you'd like to hear from. So thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. I hope we will see you some more. And thank you for the AU team that's here, and look forward to talking to you more about being a woman in the arena.